So in his sermons over our Lenten series, Jason has referenced this blessing from the Judaic tradition. May you be covered in the dust of your rabbi. This comes from the fact that disciples would often walk so close to their rabbis that the dust and the dirt of the road would end up on them. And they did this so they could see and hear everything that the rabbi was saying, and so they could imitate him as closely as possible. And Jesus' disciples would have done this during his ministry here on earth. But what happened to their dust-covered feet once they reached wherever they were going? Well, we just read a passage about this, so I think you might have some idea, but let me give you some context around it. In order to keep homes clean, it was customary for the lowest ranked servant to be tasked with washing the feet of guests who arrived in a home. And given the dirt and dust of the roads, as we've talked about, this was a disgusting job. Washing feet was not something that a rabbi, a teacher, would ever do for his disciples. So when Jesus performs this task, the Messiah taking on the role of a servant, of course the disciples are shocked and confused. But out of all of them, the only one we actually hear from is Peter. He seems to sit there in shock as he watches his rabbi, this miracle worker, wash his friend's feet. He can only find his tongue once Jesus kneels before him to conduct the same mundane task. Maybe his voice is a half octave higher in protest, snatching his feet away from Jesus' hands as he insists that Jesus will never wash them. But once Jesus explains what he's doing, and once Peter seems to understand, then he's all in, which is very in character for this high-energy, dedicated, stubborn disciple who will ultimately go on to become one of the leaders of Jesus' church in just under a month from this passage. Now, this doesn't mean he isn't still confused, especially with Jesus' final comment about not everyone being clean. Speaking of which, what about Judas? How does he feel here, knowing that he was selling his teacher and his friend's life for 30 pieces of silver? Did his confidence waver as Jesus washed his feet? Or was he now even more sure that Jesus was not who he said he was? Because what great leader, what Messiah would willingly wash someone else's feet? And there can be some confusion here for us reading this passage. We're not as acquainted with the social context of it, but we are with the rest of the gospel. I don't make it a secret that I am not the biggest fan of the Gospel of John, mainly because Jesus is portrayed here as more divine than human, and for me personally, that's just a lot harder for me to connect to. He seems to just sort of float through these passages, more godlike than human. Miracles often involve little more than just Jesus speaking them into existence. And even when he interacts with his disciples and his family, he just seems to be above it all. But then we come to this passage. This is one of the very few places where Jesus hits the ground. The details here are humanizing, tying the towel around his waist, pouring the water into a basin, and tenderly wiping the disciples' feet dry. He's no longer floating above it all. In fact, he has positioned himself below his followers. We also know that Jesus is less than a day away from the cross at this point. So why take time out of his precious few hours left on this earth to make sure his disciples' feet are clean? Well, because as you might already be thinking, this is about a lot more than just washing feet. This past weekend at Disciple Now, we all talked about calling and vocation. We defined this using author and pastor Frederick Buechner's definition of vocation that Charles talked about earlier, where our deep gladness meets the world's deep hunger. We explored what God might be calling us to do in our lives. And we looked at the story of Andrew in John 1, and how when he was called by Jesus, he not only followed, but he also ran and got his brother to become a disciple. His brother was actually Peter, who ends up getting quite a bit more page time than Andrew does. Poor Andrew. But the point was that we all have these different callings and gifts and abilities. While we're capable of doing some things on our own, when we work together, we are capable of so much more. And sometimes working together may mean taking a step outside of your comfort zone or taking on a project or task that is outside of the scope of what you normally do. Okay, serious question. Who just cringed a little bit when I said step out of your comfort zone? It's fully okay if you did. It is this phrase that we hear over and over again in work and in school and in basically every self-help book I've ever read. Sometimes I'm beginning to wonder if this phrase is starting to lose meaning. Besides, who wants to step outside of their comfort zone now when even what is comfortable and regular and normal can just be so tiring sometimes? And if we can find a moment of comfort and peace, then why would we want to give that up? Who wants to trek into the scorching sun to mow your neighbor's lawn or drive 20 minutes out of your way with your children screaming in the back seat to deliver food to someone? Who wants their lives, their plans, to be interrupted in order to make someone else's day run just a little bit smoother? I think in a lot of ways, we are still trying to recover from the upheaval in our lives over the past 4 years. Less and less people are volunteering for shorter amounts of time in churches, in animal shelters, at food banks, and in basically every other area of life you can think of, which makes a lot of sense. We are being pulled in 1,000 different directions between work and family. We are exhausted from raising children and caring for aging parents, and we are starting to see an increase in the number of people who do both. We are trying to figure out how we're going to cover that sudden medical expense or the water heater breaking down. We've got so little time and resources, we just don't have any left to share. And we don't want to give up any of the few pieces of comfort we have left, right? I think that is exactly where Jesus is at here. I know he is portrayed as very divine in John, but he is still fully human, and Jesus is not at his best here. I can almost hear the anxious tone, sense his troubled spirit, as the next chapter will say, over the next 5 chapters, as Jesus tries to cram the last little bits of teaching he has into his disciples' heads before he's arrested. He's out of time, he's exhausted, and what's about to happen is just continually scratching at the back of his head. And yet, in the midst of it all, he still kneels on hard clay floor and washes his disciples' dusty, sweaty feet. It cannot have been comfortable. I also wonder what the disciples thought after Jesus' resurrection, when they would look back on this moment. Think about it. They witnessed their friend and their rabbi die and then defeat death by walking out of his tomb. They only had a few more days with him before he ascended into heaven, and then they were left here on earth to carry out Jesus' mission, their new calling on their lives. And now they're building up a new community of faith, making sure widows and orphans are cared for, and teaching people about Jesus from everywhere, from the dust-covered streets of Jerusalem to prison cells all the way in Rome. You know how some memories just stay with you? The smell of chocolate chip cookies at Grandma's house, the sound of crickets chirping on a hot summer's night, and the feeling of crawling into bed in your first apartment or your first house after a long day of moving in. What if every time the disciples came back home after a long day and washed their aching feet, they remembered Jesus' hands doing the same thing for them? Of course, I believe that Jesus washed the disciples' feet because he was modeling servant leadership and humility and dozens of other traits I am sure you associate with this story. And these will be traits and gifts that the disciples will carry with them as they build the church. But that memory also carries the reminder of love and the care that Jesus had for them. Because that moment was anything but ordinary. It was love personified and sacred. It was holiness radiating off the mundane splash of water and the rustling of a towel. The thing about these little miracles of service is that they do require some discomfort. They require temporarily restructuring your life for the sake of somebody else. But that momentary unease can lead to a loving memory that lasts for the rest of that person's life. And even in just the past 6 months here, I have witnessed and heard story after story of these kinds of events. Let's take our student ministry, for example. Just this past weekend, the Hiltons, Dilts, Bartlows, and Phillips opened up their homes as host families to our students for Disciple Now. Other volunteers like Jack, Tony, and Robin stepped in to help lead groups or cook meals for them. And on top of that, these students are also led on a regular basis by a phenomenal group of small group leaders: Jordan, Beth, Catherine, Mark, Heather, and Laura. And our students themselves are already serving our church. Just a few weeks ago, we had Naomi and Kaylee up here talking about how they are serving as Sunday school children's leaders. And they were inspired to do so by their own leaders from when they were children, Charlie and Loretta. So who knows which children in their class they will inspire to be leaders in the next 10 to 15 years. And then there's the residency program, which is the entire reason that I'm here. You as Second Baptist are willing to invite a new pastor who is just learning how to preach into your pulpit. You let us make mistakes, and you let us figure out what it's going to look like for us to become pastors. Everyone here is committed to a certain level of change, which inherently brings a little bit of discomfort by having this program that gets a new resident every year or two. And even beyond that, almost 30 of you have now stepped up to serve as members of our support teams that help us shape us into better pastors. Greg Duncan, Linda Greason, Leslie Bunch, and Michelle Peck have served as leaders of our support teams, providing us critical spaces to process our callings and our ministry experiences. There's this saying that it takes a village to raise a child, and that's true, but it also takes sacrifice and commitment from a church to train a pastor. And it's a commitment that not only benefits us as residents, but also the churches and the ministries that we will go on to serve, and therefore the church at large. Friends, this is what service is. Holy, ordinary miracles of love where we interrupt our lives to step into someone else, even if just for a moment. It's the miracle of finding a shoulder to cry on in the early storms of grief. It's the miracle of not having to cook dinner when sickness is weighing down your body. And it's the miracle of getting like 12 electric griddles when you didn't even know those existed until 2 weeks before you were hosting a pancake dinner. Okay, maybe that last one is just a miracle to me. It is uncomfortable to step out of your life and into someone else's. It takes time and it takes effort, and those can be hard to scrape together. But the results can have an impact far beyond what we thought possible. And it can even come back to us when we need it the most. So whose hands do you remember caring for you? And whose memories of love are your hands caring for them? Amen.